Welcome to the Convergence Podcast. I'm your host, Ashok Sivanand.
You should be looking to ship fast and learn as quickly as possible. You can spend infinite amount of time on polish, but if the underlying mechanic for how people interact with your game isn't compelling, all of that time is just thrown out the window.
On this show, we'll deconstruct the best practices, principles, and the underlying philosophies behind the most engaged product teams who ship the most successful products. This is what teams are made of. Welcome back, folks. On this episode, I get to speak with my good friend, Jarrett Quan-Hin, who's a co-founder and the head of product at Mantle. We get to talk about Jarrett's journey from the video game industry to leading product management teams, and how Jarrett thinks the video game industry has really influenced product development at large, especially in the areas of rapid iteration, as well as building really engaging user experiences. We get to talk about the challenges associated with building and managing cap tables in a venture-backed business, and how Mantle brings order and insight to this really chaotic process. We, of course, get into what it's like to prioritize features on Mantle's roadmap, despite having 3 different customer segments, and how an intentional approach to parallelizing work has helped them ship products a lot faster. We then get to talk about the differences and nuances of building a startup from 0 to 1, the role of generative AI in product development, and the nuances and tips and tricks of building really strong relationships with your business as well as your engineering team as a non-technical product manager. This episode is extra special for me because when I first joined the Pivotal Labs team, Jarrett and I worked together on a connected vehicle app. And it's through Jarrett's mentorship and frankly patience that I was able to take that raw horsepower that I brought to the team and fine tune it into product expertise in the Pivotal Labs culture. So it was super great for me to catch up with Jarrett, and I have a hunch you're really going to enjoy the show too. Let us know what you think in the comments, or if you have any questions for Jarrett. I've really been looking forward to this conversation. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
As you can see, since we have a Toronto guest on, I'm wearing my Toronto Raptors shirt from a couple of years ago. Hey, so, first thing I usually like to ask a lot of the product folks coming on, since we've all had very topsy-turvy ways of getting into product management. How did you get in there?
Yeah, so it kind of stems back from a childhood and continuing love of video games. When I was really young, my dream career was, being a video game tester. So being able to play video games all day sounded fantastic. As I grew up and entered high school, I started realizing probably not the greatest, or not the right career path for me. I'll put it that way. And so I started looking at other ways that I could kind of be involved in the video game industry. My dad worked in finance for Coca-Cola for a lot of years. And so I started thinking if there's some sort of back office style way of getting into the video game space, maybe I can then slide my way into a producer role and go from there. So I ended up going to university for marketing with a focus once I graduated on getting a marketing gig in the game industry and seeing if I could do that. My first job outside of university was an internship with a game studio in the mobile space called Little Guy Games. And when I was interviewing with Tom Francel, the CEO, he asked me what my aspirations were. So I was just straight up with him, said, I am interested in the marketing role, but ultimately I'd really love to actually get involved in the production of video games. And essentially within the first few weeks, the company was very busy at the time. They had a first party project side of things, as well as a professional services wing. So between building out our own games and building games out for other studios like CBS Interactive, there were a lot of projects that Tom was essentially producing on his own. In the video game industry, producer title very similar to product manager. And so essentially a few weeks in, he said, "Hey, I could use some help with this. You said you were interested. Do you want to take these on?" And that was when I started dipping my toes into the realm of product development. So ideation, road mapping, sprint planning, even client demos and presentations as we were showing the builds week to week. And then probably most importantly, how to work and engage with a team of developers were all things that I got a very intense and an amazing boot camp from my time there with.
One of the things there that I think I tend to find myself giving folks advice on with respect to career path is really important to share your aspirations, and leadership and other folks making the decisions don't know what you want to do. And we might negotiate with ourselves of how many steps it might take and how many years and everything else. And here you are 2 weeks in. I'm sure you made a really great impression 2 weeks in as someone who I've gotten to work with. But on top of that, the fact that the CEO knew what you wanted to do made it a lot easier for him to ask you that and maybe take a leap of faith that you might be good at it because it's something that you have enthusiasm around.
Yeah. And I think especially when it comes to those small team type spaces, like I think Little Guy at the time had maybe 10 folks working in it between art, engineering, and then Tom was basically the only, well, he was a coder originally, but he just shifted into a business role, and he was the only other person that was available to take on that work set. So once there was somebody else who demonstrated interest, I think that really helped unlock a lot of his time as well to be able to focus on other elements.
How did things go from there to where you're now at Mantle?
So as much as I love video games as a hobby, the industry is a bit of a meat grinder. There's a lot of talent supply, which drives salaries down. It increases pressure for working longer hours. Like mandatory churn is just a fact of life in the games industry. And it is very much like, if you're still in it, it's because you really, really love it and can't imagine yourself being anywhere else. Personally, I could imagine myself being somewhere else and still enjoying games. So after a year and a half or so at Little Guy, I started keeping my eyes out for opportunities where I could transfer the skill sets that I'd learned there. And that's when I applied for a role as a product manager at Extreme Labs and got into the mobile app space at large instead of focusing purely on mobile games.
Extreme Labs, of course, a place that Jarrett and I got to work together, a really leading mobile engineering and product company that exited back in 2013. You've got to transition from gaming into, well, what is a gaming industry called non-gaming? Is there a word for it?
I don't know, meat space, like the real world.
Fair enough. Well, maybe we'll just use the term real world applications, and I'm sure we'll get told in the comments what we should have called it. Anyway, there's a lot of amazing things that I think the gaming industry has learned with, what I'm most interested in is with respect to engagement, right? What drives us to continue kind of going along the pathway of the game where it's very intuitive, of a user experience that you have, and then something that really keeps us coming back. Something that's, of course, not just applicable to games, applicable to real world applications, as we call it. And so have you noticed any trends like that or any examples of applications that really borrow from gaming really well to drive engagement, adoption, and other product benefits?
Yeah. I think there's a couple concepts that stand true in gaming that have carried over from my time there into product development at large. I think one of the first ones, which really taps into some of the fundamental principles of lean design, is just that fundamental truth that you should be looking to ship fast and learn as quickly as possible. The game industry really boils it down because you can spend infinite amount of time on polish for your game and having the best art, the nicest animations, the most bells and whistles. But if the underlying mechanic for how people interact with your game isn't compelling, all of that time is just thrown out the window. And it's always a challenge in video games to feel like you're ready to ship and that it looks like it's going to make the best impression. But like games like Flappy Bird that you may remember, like way back in the day, are a good example of like, hey, as long as you have a good fundamental mechanic, the look and feel of it kind of comes secondary. And so you'll see studios, especially in the mobile space, like Half Brick, who did like Fruit Ninja and Jetpack Joyride, and then Rovio, the Angry Birds folks, did a really good job of finding those mechanics first and then building a level of polish atop them that just took it to the next level. Towards the tail end of my time at Little Guy, my buddy Brett had been pitching this idea of a branch of the company that we'd call, I think he called it Snot Shotgun. The idea being like we just run hackathons to build really bare bones versions of game mechanics to put out into the market, look to see which ones got the most attention, and then take that to then build a more full-fleshed game out on top of. Unfortunately, we both left Little Guy before that came to fruition, but the idea of getting a minimum viable version of something out and see if it has the level of hook that you think it should before you invest a lot more time into it is something that I definitely carry with me.
I don't know why it is that I also thought of Flappy Bird as you talked about the mechanics. And maybe it's because you and I were sitting next to each other playing a ton of it. But anything else in terms of UX or UI that from a user perspective, you think the gaming industry has helped the rest of development at large?
Yeah, I think there's another concept in gaming of skill floors and skill ceilings that translates really well to product and UX considerations. So I guess to step back and explain those a bit further, skill floors are like the minimum level of skill that you need to be effective in a game. Whereas a skill ceiling is kind of the maximum potential effectiveness that you can have. And so if you've played a game, say like Super Smash Bros. Back in the day at a party where there's a bunch of different characters and say you have Kirby on one side who more approachable. If you get smacked off the stage, you can just float and fly back on. And you're having fun because you're instantly getting a level of engagement. And then there are more complex characters like Ness, if you remember him as well, where there's a higher skill floor because his moveset is super strange. But once you've figured out how he works, theoretically more powerful and more capable than Kirby is. But Smash Bros. As a product or as a game is really good at providing that mix of characters with low skill floors and high skill ceilings and mixes there in between where anybody at any skill level can come into that game and have fun immediately and grow to appreciate the game further. And that's a kind of mindset that's important for non-gaming products to have in place as well. Like as you start building for depth of capability on your platform, you still need to be very conscious of the fact that not everyone is going to come in with a relatively high skill level. And so you need to try and keep that skill floor low so that even if they're not masters at the start, they can build that out, build that capability and build the capability out over time in order to achieve and demonstrate mastery over time.
I heard the term progressive disclosure recently that comes to mind. And I think it's used in a book about the making of the game Prince of Persia. And like, I think in that game, from what I remember, like literally like it doesn't shine the light on areas that you haven't explored or skills that you haven't gained yet. Right. So it's less overwhelming for a new person, but for someone who's already been there, it's more intuitive and they can continue making progress. Fostering an engaged product organization and aligning them with the principles around lean, human-centered design, and agile will more than likely lead to successful business outcomes for your organization. But getting started or getting unblocked can be hard. This podcast is brought to you by the player coaches over at Integral. They help ambitious companies like you build amazing product teams and ship products in artificial intelligence, cloud, web, and mobile. Listeners to the podcast can head on over to integral.io/convergence and get a free product success lab. During this session, the Integral team will facilitate a problem-solving exercise that gives you clarity and confidence to solve a product, design, or engineering problem. That's integral.io/convergence. Now, back to the show. So now you are currently at Mantle, one of the co-founders. And so tell us about Mantle.
Mantle as a company is really focused on bringing order and insight to the data that drives the venture capital industry. And that's quite intentionally a broad statement. We're starting off with a focus on the equity management or capitalization or cap table space to help founders, operators, and all of the folks that are helping build and run a business understand who owns what of the company, how they got it, and use that information to not only ensure that it's always accurately kept up to date, but also allow someone to start planning for the future off the top of that data and very quickly act on it as they need to.
So tell me a little bit more about why this is a problem and kind of all the permutations and stuff that happen as startups raise rounds that makes this really relevant versus an Excel spreadsheet being good enough.
Yeah. And I think the biggest two challenges that we've seen kind of emerge as we've been getting into this space are the sources of truth for what a cap table is essentially a whole bunch of unstructured data. So you have your legal agreements, board consents, corporate filings, all these different elements that are representing like atomic actions that take place within the course of life of a business. And they all come in the form of long form text. And so what ends up happening, or what's traditionally been happening, is you're taking elements of that text and normalizing it in a spreadsheet or in a platform where some or all of those elements are held. And then you're essentially looking to hold that information and act on it from there. I think the challenge that we've seen in addition to that is that the systems that are storing this information aren't necessarily geared or trying to facilitate planning out into the future. And so they're focused more on being backwards looking repositories. And what comes about from that is, so say you've been managing your cap table on a spreadsheet or on a platform, and you're looking to either figure out what your hiring plan for the next while is going to be and how many options to give, or you're planning out a potential financing round to start building your business even further. You're usually either creating a copy of your spreadsheet or exporting your cap table to a spreadsheet and then starting to manipulate it from there in order to figure out what changes do I want to make, what kind of effects does it have, and at that point you've already, to use like a repo management example, you've made a branch of a cap table at that point where you're starting to figure stuff out and you're making changes. But I'm a huge fan of spreadsheets. I know you're a massive fan of spreadsheets as well. But because cap tables are a summary of all of those atomic transactions and you're dealing in a space where you're trying to summarize it, the moment you start making those changes in a system as open and flexible as a spreadsheet, the propensity for errors to creep in or for data to get convoluted just grows exponentially, especially when you then start handing it off to your finance team or to HR or to your law firm to vet it. The branch of your cap table starts to get a little complex, so that even by the time you feel like you've reached the point where you're ready to merge your information back in, there may be merge conflicts. Like you may have issues or things drifted away from what you intended, or even as you're executing those changes, things may not fully reflect what you had planned out. And so for us, minimizing or eliminating that gap between the source of truth, the repository for where that source of truth is held and reasoned about, and where you're then planning off the top of it is a key focus for us to ensure that drift doesn't occur.
This kind of the current state of the roadmap, I should say, was arrived at after a few pivots along the way. So what's a little bit of a history about how y'all kind of started down this idea, what your personal passion was, and how did you arrive at kind of the current roadmap and customers that seem really happy?
The company was founded in early 2022 when the Web3 industry was at its zenith, or at least its last zenith. And so we were really looking for like just experimenting with ways that we could utilize Web3 technology or applications for blockchain in facilitating some sort of product. And we'd started looking at the venture capital space. Safes or simple agreements for future equity were are still a very popular way of companies raising money initially, outside of say like the founders bootstrapping it. And so we were like, hey, what if we start playing around with the idea of making a Web3 version of safes that help, really, really concretely state, here are the terms of the safe. We have proof that payment's been made. There's immutable proof on the blockchain that this information and this agreement has been made. As we started talking to potential customers and even companies that had already completed their raises that were kind of outside the capture area of this product, we realized bulletproof isn't really the metric that drives value for safes. Mistakes can creep in at either the source level agreement or at the point of recording it. And so if those mistakes get made and they need to correct it, having it etched in stone is actually counterproductive. And in the Web3 space, especially if you're building on a primary technology or chain like Ethereum, it's very expensive to correct those changes as you're etching the information in. That realization was kind of compounded by the fact that as we were building out a product in the Web3 space, you're building out an architecture on immutable data stores. And so anywhere you're looking to quickly pivot or correct mistakes that are made, it's expensive to make those changes. It's a fledgling industry where a lot of the core components that you would normally take for granted in like a standard database management system aren't there yet. And so you're doing a lot more in order to get the same level of functionality that you would otherwise want to see in an initial version of a product. So the compounding force of both the market telling us something needed to wasn't fully matching up or correct there, and our own realization that we were moving slower than we otherwise would want to if we were looking to build out a POC and vet out the product before building it out, led us to start moving away from Web3 as a backing system. And initially it started off with us focusing on using databases to prove out safe raises. Then we started realizing, safes only go so far. If the share counts aren't right, then the safes don't really matter as much, or that it's the smaller part of the problem. So we started expanding our focus from safes to the shares that they then eventually convert into, to the option plans that tie into the total share count for the company. And we've kind of built it out from there. And that shift away from Web3 to a database backend really allowed us to very much more quickly prove out each of the fundamental tenets of those and start to progressively build atop it and restructure things where necessary in order to get to where we're at today, where we're able to capture a company's full capitalization history.
So safes, for anyone who may not have heard of it, are a much simpler alternative as a vehicle for investors to invest in startups and have the contracts and everything taken care of around what happens in various scenarios, all the way from really successful exits through to if that company doesn't do as well and goes through a liquidation or something like that. And I think we used to use convertible notes before, which were lengthy and complicated in the early 2010s. I believe it was Y Combinator that is at least credited for inventing it, that came up with like a 2 to 4 page document that you could read without needing a lawyer in the room for the most part. And one thing that I heard there was that if you are building a Web3 app, which even if you're not at a zenith, I think there are some use cases that have stood the test of time where it really makes sense. There is an argument for maybe proving out the concept, not necessarily using the Web3 technology, and then switching to Web3 because the cost of iteration is a lot higher if you go Web3 native. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think that's very fair to say. The amount of additional infrastructure that the team had put in place in order to push changes back in the day when we were still built atop blockchain rails was extensive, and that's all been taken out of the equation now that we're just interacting with standard databases.
Well, that super interesting around a lean experimentation around Web3. Coming back to Mantle, how do your customers find you today? How does your product team go out and do research with prospective customers or future customers?
Ummer, one of the co-founders, has a very deep, extensive network, and so early on it was largely with friendlies, so just folks that we already had relationships with, essentially by way of Ummer's background, and having them use the product as early adopters and design partners who we could work very closely with on not only implementing or using our product, but also giving us a lot of tight feedback to start dialing things in. From there, once we had that kind of core base of friendlies in place, there was some word of mouth that came from them to other folks, and we also started uh, establishing some relationships with different accelerators and incubators to help give them some I guess a bit of a leg up to their cohorts, and saying like, hey, not only are you getting the benefits of being part of an accelerator and incubator, your cap table can get managed through this platform that's on offer for free for the first year. The incubators get a benefit in that if they get enough of them on board, then they can start seeing all of their respective equity within each of those businesses and keeping track of it, and generating a bit of a network effect in that regard. And then more recently, we've also been kind of making the rounds with a number of law firms in both Canada and the US to look to provide them with a level of utility where either they can source the software and manage their version of a company's or a client's cap table themselves, or they can refer us as one of the many providers for someone to look at, to take a look at and go from there.
Like, let me synthesize first to confirm I'm understanding. You've got three sort of stakeholders or target audiences. You've got the founders and operators within the startup. You've got the investors, like the incubators or VC firms. And then you've got service providers like the law firms or whoever else might be helping. And the second two, I can totally understand from a distribution standpoint, are extremely valuable. From coming back to prioritizing your roadmap features, now you've got three balls to juggle up there. And so what has that been like? What are some lessons learned with respect to prioritizing across three sets of stakeholders, or three sets of customers, I should say, at such an early stage?
Yeah, it's definitely been a challenge, a fun challenge, but a challenge nonetheless. And there's a lot more than just three. We've tried to dial it into just focusing on those three off the bat, but the number of groups that all work off of the same set of like base information is extensive. Like eventually we're going to be getting into financial or an accounting reporting based on cap tables and things like that as well. We're waiting to uncork that bottle when it's time. But what we essentially realized, like we're blessed to have as large of a founding team as we do, which means we can parallelize a lot of work. And so we've looked to kind of identify the key types of behaviors that these different groups use. Some of the archetypes land more solidly on one product block versus the other, but we're looking to see how we can kind of move all those balls forward at the same time. And so the three swim lanes, as we've described them internally, are so recording. So basically, given information that already exists, are we able to put that data into the platform easily, reliably, and accurately? There is execute, which speaks probably more to the founder side on like, hey, once this information has been onboarded and I'm looking to continue to, like, say, issue new options, issue a new safe, execute a price round, how am I adding those changes in additively to the information that's already been put onto the platform? And then analyze, which is, given that I have all this information on the platform, how can I use it to inform my decision making in the future as well? And so we're kind of marching along all three of those swim lanes as different roadmaps within, or prioritization sets within a cohesive product, so that we're not dropping the ball on any one given customer. That said, we will usually see opportunities that come up where we'll shift focus to, say, like staff more folks on one side versus the other. The advent of, or the uprising of LLMs and generative AI in general have given us a lot of ideas on the record space, where we can utilize LLMs to understand and extract information. And so that's taken a bit of a focus for the time being, but we are still very much looking to keep moving forward on that, the execute and planning or analyze side of things, at the same time, just so that we're not losing any momentum that we've got on those sides.
That's amazing. And I think there's probably a fair amount of sophistication that is not necessarily coming across in how simply you define that around the three teams. We've, you and I together and separately probably have seen different ways in which companies, big and small, organize their teams and how big of an impact it has downstream with respect to how quickly you can respond to change and how much it costs to do that. So was that kind of something that was intuitive from the beginning, or did it take a few tries before you arrived at those kind of large teams or chunks?
Yeah, it took a while. I think originally coming into building the company, I tried to uphold the idealistic standard of a single master prioritization list that we worked top down through. I think there's a balance to be struck between focusing on, like, ruthlessly focusing on a single priority at a time and working your way down versus realizing that there are some opportunities that may vanish if you don't take some strategic risks and pull some things up a little further. And so breaking apart those different work streams for the teams to be able to work on allowed us to kind of unleash that ability of having known core focuses that we definitely need to hit, while also still being able to strive for some strategic things that we thought were going to give us a bit of differentiation in an industry that is already pretty well established.
And what do people tend to do today? I mentioned spreadsheets. Is that kind of the alternative? And then is digging through a bunch of versions of spreadsheets and trying to remember which one's the latest and greatest, and then having to apply a whole bunch of additional time to try and look at the correlated documents to that?
The earlier a company is in their life cycle, the more likely they are to be on spreadsheets. And there's a lot of stickiness to it because spreadsheets are free. But I'd say with our current customer base, it was about 75% of companies had come off of spreadsheets to our platform. Maybe 20% came off of the large incumbent in the space, Carta, and then another 5% off of other competitors in the market as well. So there are folks who've moved to existing platforms for managing their cap tables, but the goal there is for us to sufficiently differentiate ourselves that it's not just a matter of us getting the fundamentals right, that we're adding some moments of delight and things like that'll keep them coming back or realizing that there's value to be unlocked in their cap table beyond what Carta currently offers.
So let's zoom out a little bit here back to your career. You have worked on various 0 to 1 things, including Mantle, maybe some of the video games. And then you've also worked as a consultant. You've worked on the product side at a startup that you founded, as well as, I believe, at enterprises. So in terms of, that's a lot of diversity of roles that you've done well at, and you've worked alongside other folks that maybe didn't necessarily thrive in that kind of context switching that you are pretty great at. There's kind of a different mindset we need to apply, and maybe someone at a leadership level, a different team that you need to hire when you're going from that 0 to 1 versus a 1 to N. So what are some of the things you noticed along the way?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things, like by way of background of the team, is we were working on connected cloud software for a major OEM prior to co-founding Mantle, and so there's a large focus on building resilient products that aren't going to fail and are able to handle a lot of volume. And we're shifting our focus away from something that needs to be ultra resilient to something that just needs to prove that it has market traction. And so the requirements that come into play are the things that are the most important when figuring out how to build something out from a product and engineering perspective shifts a lot when going between those two mindsets. And that was definitely something that we had to adjust to over time. I'd definitely say, early days, we bias towards, let's spend a lot of time figuring out the right way to build this before we start building it. And we had to get to very quickly, due to our runway in the early days, get to how do we very quickly prove out what we think is going to have traction and what presents the best opportunity to go to market with that isn't going to leave us high and dry before we've been able to get to that answer.
Right. There's a huge difference between the connected cloud and the automotive space, where you got millions of vehicles multiplied by millions of signals, all happening in very real time, to more of the startup space where the domain is very different too. And then, have you noticed any differences in terms of talent around who would do really well in that 0 to 1 versus in the 1 to 100? And when it comes to hiring or interviewing, does that come into play for you at all?
Yeah, I mean, early days, we had a big focus on just making sure that we were acquiring senior talent, just to kind of build out as deep of a experience base as possible, like folks who were comfortable with the idea of requirements shifting kind of under their feet as we were discovering things. And then once we started getting a bit more of the product foundation in place, we started expanding to looking towards, like, we started up our co-op program with a couple of the universities, and are looking to start to broaden that talent base, like bring in younger talent and get them facilitated with or familiarized with what it's like to work up in a startup environment. I think the idea of veterans coming in and being unfazed by a lot of variables shifting was definitely the right move for us at the time. But it's nice to get fresh perspectives in as well as we start to see these new grads get involved in building out the product and coming in with their ideas and inspiration.
I'm going to switch gears a little bit and go back to something you said around generative AI. And this is something that's changing the way that we organize and do work, as well as the capabilities we can bring to our customers in the product, right? So maybe let's start with the product, since you touched on that already. And where are you really seeing a lot of applicability at Mantle?
I'll describe us as a pretty dog food heavy org. Originally, as we were starting to onboard customers, it was largely myself, and Amit, who's on the biz ops side of the company, onboarding companies, and therefore looking at lots and lots of documents in order to translate that and normalize it into the information that we're putting on our platform. What we found was we were spending like hours up front reading the documents, pulling out information into a standard format, and then once we had all the information, it was relatively straightforward to solve for it. And that's when we started realizing, especially because LLMs were coming to the fore right around the same time, that there is a massive opportunity to utilize this technology to facilitate that very time-intensive effort up front and convert it into a strategic strength of our own. And so what we started experimenting with is utilizing LLMs to, like, on receiving a document, understand and categorize the type of document that's being pulled in. Like I mentioned earlier, there's legal agreements, like a bunch of different types of legal agreements, board consents, and corporate filings that are all involved in managing a cap table. So understanding which of them it is, regardless of whether it's, please DocuSign.pdf or so-and-so's articles of incorporation. From there, executing a series of prompts against that document for the LLM to extract a lot of that information reliably and accurately, and then taking that information and normalizing it as appropriate, which then drops, from a user's perspective, the time from a matter of hours to a matter of minutes.
And when you say normalizing, what does that mean in this context? Is it integrating into your database or CSV?
Yeah, so primarily, or as a starting point, normalizing into our database. More recently, we've also been highly engaged with the Open Cap Table Coalition, which is essentially a consortium of legal, like law firms, folks in the equity management space, payroll, like anybody who's building software that touches cap table data, looking to standardize around a single unified data model that allows us to all speak the same language and support data transferability.
That's amazing. And you said it's Open Cap Table Consortium?
The Open Cap Table Coalition, or OCT.
Coalition. Okay, we'll put that in the show notes. Can I put a plug in there for some? Maybe this is a place we can start normalizing an NDA, so everyone kind of generally agrees for the most part what that format looks like, versus having to go have both sides go review it legally. Is that something you can put into play there?
Yeah, and definitely something we yeah.
Cool. And then what about with respect to the product development side of things? You and I have worked together as product development consultants and coaches to help organizations with improving process. So it's something we've gotten to spend a lot of time on here at Integral as well, with respect to where does generative AI speed you up in the dev cycle, and where does it maybe more distract you and slow you down? So any war stories or anything to share from Mantle?
Yeah, I think for me, the two aspects that come to mind are I have carved a career out in a technical space as an inherently non-technical or non-engineering person. And so I think LLMs and the I guess generative AI coming onto the scene has really helped me feel like I'm able to vet something more quickly without necessarily having a reliance on an engineer to help make it a thing. Like the fact that I can interact and that the LLM even benefits from me interacting with it in a natural language mindset blows my mind and allows me to quickly just be like, hey, if I were to take this block of text and give it to you and then try to pull information out, I, can I get those results? And then if I can get those results and say like taking a 2 paragraph long description of a vesting schedule translated into the JSON model for our API, and then show the engineers like, hey, I think this is possible. Do you think we can start folding that into the product? It feels a lot more straightforward than me just having to say like just sell my vision to them and then hope I can get everybody onto the same page. It does a little bit of normalizing or converging the points of discussion or mindset that we're coming in on. I'd say the other aspect is just whenever I write anything in Notion, it tends to be paragraphs and paragraphs long. So the ability for AI to just summarize that for an engineer or for our CEO to read, or even just for myself to boil it down so that it doesn't look like a gigantic wall of text is ultra helpful from a personal development perspective.
You know, sometimes it's easy to forget that you didn't come from a technical background. If one were to observe your interactions with the technical team, or be able to kind of work with stakeholders and non folks outside of the dev team with respect to doing things that, you know, I would typically expect folks who are a little bit more of a technical background to come from. So what is your advice for product managers that didn't necessarily grow up through the engineering ranks like I did, to kind of the just enough or good enough level of technical capability? How did that come about for you?
It largely came about from me just looking to kind of be helpful. I end up kind of playing, or at least early on, playing the role of uh, the naive person asking naive questions in order to not only bolster my own understanding of how things were getting built out, but also see if there were additional considerations or things that folks didn't have in mind when ideating on how to solve a given engineering problem. And then as I started getting feedback on like where I was right or where I was missing the mark, it started to paint more of a picture in my head as to how things worked. And that's probably the biggest advice I can give, is just demonstrating a lot of curiosity and openness to understanding what it is that's driving the the engineering decisions that are being made, even if it's just at a high level descriptive level. And then eventually you start seeing those patterns emerge, and seeing how they fit together. I'd liken it to, if you have like a lot of people with extensive vocabularies pick them up by reading a lot of books and seeing those words in context, and they may not necessarily know the actual definition of some of the words that they're using, but they know how they fit at its core. And I think a lot of the discussions that at least I participate in at the engineering level feel very similar, to where I see how these concepts and ideas fit together and can participate in a discussion even without fully understanding everything that's involved underneath.
I'm going to switch gears a little bit here. And a question that I love to ask all my guests is about a product that you recently got to use, whether at home or at work at Mantle, and that totally blew your socks off, that you were very delighted by. And, as product folks, I know we tend to really scrutinize the entire experience. So there are one or two things that come to mind there for you.
I'll sidestep the very deep rabbit hole that I've fallen down with regards to mechanical keyboards and all the different components there, just because it's way too nerdy and way too deep of a rabbit hole. But aside from that,
I like to think that both of those are not the case here on the Convergence podcast, but I will follow your lead.
But to something that's probably a little more accessible, the two things that I've really gravitated towards more recently, back to the concept of like virtual space versus real world. I've really, really taken a liking to pocket notebooks for taking notes. So I've got just a whole bunch of field notes. I used to just write everything down in Notion, and I would be quite literally transcribing meetings as I was going along, and then not really absorbing a lot of the information or condensing the findings. And so moving back to a paper-based medium with a paper and pen has really forced me to focus on like, what am I writing down? As I get loose thoughts, I can jot them down there. They're always easily retrievable. And then I just have a stack of these things that are building up at my desk at work for me to be able to come back to and reflect on as well. So that's one aspect for day-to-day, just organizing the sheer volume of thoughts that come to mind.
Well, it sounds like you're moving away, so I have some questions about this. I've got stacks of notebooks as well, and I've used like a Remarkable tablet, the Amazon Scribe now. It's kind of as ways to try and digitize it, but it doesn't quite feel the same as pen and paper for me. And I'm curious to know if you've tackled that at all, or if you just kind of declared bankruptcy on that digitization idea and come back to it. Or there's even these pens now that I've seen. I don't know if you've tried those out, that tend to apparently they record on the pen and you can write on regular paper.
Yeah.
I'm going down a rabbit hole.
Yeah. I mean, for me personally, it was like, if there's like, this is an area for like my thoughts to sit and kind of marinate and as they crop up, like, the reason why I went with a tiny notebook is it can fit in my back pocket. So I just always have it handy along with a pen in my pocket. If there's anything worth kind of building out from there, that's then my opportunity to like turn it into a to-do inside this notebook with a bullet point beside it, go into Notion or whatever other system I need to kind of flesh that out further, cross it off the list of data that I've extracted and kind of condensed into information in a more accessible location. And then I've dedicated like the first 2 pages of each of these notebooks to just being able to pinpoint what page particular like important ideas and things came to, so that if I do ever want to just index directly from something, it's a matter of just going through the first page or 2 on each of these notebooks versus like every single page and things like that. I'm sure as I get towards the like dozens of these, I'll probably wish I had started categorizing things further, but for now, I think it's perfectly serviceable.
What I'm hearing is that you've kind of assumed that the AI robots will have a solution for you in the future, and you're really optimizing your current workflows for future technology, and that's real visionary stuff there.
yeah, it's not too different from us, and we've more recently enabled the feature in Linear where it'll auto archive a story that hasn't been picked up or touched in 6 months, because it's like, even if you have the idea, if you're not acting on it, it's not that important. If it is that important, it'll show up again. Probably a similar idea here where like, if I haven't actioned off of something that's in this notebook by the time I've finished it and moved on, and I'm like three notebooks down, it's probably okay. I still have the safety net of finding it if I need to, but it obviously wasn't something that needed to be done immediately.
So just spiritual process of just letting go if the notebook's done. I love it. Yeah. I interrupted you. What was the other product you were building up to?
Yeah, so on a software perspective, I have become a massive fan of the Arc browser from the internet company, or the browser company in New York. It is like browsers are hard to it's a hard industry to break into, and I feel some kinship with them in that cap tables are a hard industry to break into, but they've really come in with a lot of novel ideas around how to interact with the internet and how to organize that information. As a self-confessed tab addict, uh, my Chrome browser used to just be like indecipherable numbers of tabs up along the top. I was getting extensions that would put the tabs to sleep because it was drawing so much uh, power and processing speed off of my laptops over time that the battery just wouldn't last very long. And so they had features like auto archiving as well, where if you haven't interacted with a page in, well, I've set it to 24 hours because 12 hours felt a little harsh for myself. It'll just push it away. It's saved in your history if you need it. You can organize things that never get pushed away into like pinned tabs. And over time, they've been building out this product set that just has a really, really satisfying UX to it. Like they put out Arc Search more recently, which is the mobile app. And if you're on any page, you can pinch and it'll summarize. Like it'll just toss it to an LLM that'll summarize the page contents for you. Uh, the haptics that they've integrated on the pull to refresh feel very satisfying. There's like all these little tiny notes that just like they've already hit the key features being really nice, and then they're just putting this little zhuzh on top of it that makes it feel that extra bit sticky.
If folks want to follow up or reach out and learn more about Mantle, what is the best way for them to get a hold of you?
Yeah, so we are available at withmantle.com. We'll include a link. I won't spell it out. And next week, so week of June 19th, we are going to be at Collision, the conference in Toronto. We're going to have a booth on the 19th. I've got a 5 or 4 minute lightning round presentation talking about how we're utilizing AI to take on industry giants in our space as well. And yeah, from the website, you can reach out to book a demo. You could check out a loom of the product suite and get in touch.
Awesome. Jarrett, I know you're a busy man. Thank you so much for making time. Have fun at Collision next week, and we'll catch you next time.
Yeah, thanks, Ashok.
After listening to that episode, I wanted to dig a little bit deeper on something that I find seems to have a lot of misconceptions or myths in the industry, and that's around stating your career goals explicitly. It's something that I did not do early enough in my career and transitioned towards doing and got a lot of benefit about. In Jarrett's case, I think there's two things that stand out to me. Number one, Jarrett did really well to know at that point what he wanted to do. Not all of us know that, but in his case, he did. It's important to know, too, that he changed his mind later, and he changed his trajectory later, too. And he took a much more nimble approach to something that I oftentimes find folks as I coach that work in Agile or Lean, but don't necessarily think about the malleability of their own careers the same way as they aspire to having malleability on their teams and in their products. So he knew what he wanted to do, and when he changed his mind, he changed his path as well. The second thing I think in his case involved a little bit of luck, where he was interviewing directly with the CEO and the founder of the business. And not all of us necessarily get to tell the CEO of our companies what our career aspirations are. And I don't think that means that we're dead in the water there. If you work in a bigger organization, hopefully you have one-on-ones with your manager. If you don't, it's not unreasonable to ask for one. And it's especially not unreasonable to ask for a meeting with your manager's manager or a skip level meeting. Depending on how big your organization is, that might feel really uncomfortable. It's not if you want to understand a better perspective from your manager's manager, or also even better, a different perspective from your manager's manager about how you can add value at the business and the vision of the business, as well as someone that you can state your career aspirations to. Now, there's a forcing function that comes into play here as well when you schedule that meeting with your manager or their manager, or maybe even a career coach or someone in your people or human resources department. And the forcing function is that The weekend before that, if you're someone who's a little bit more reactive like I am, you're going to be forced to sit down and actually think about what you're talking about in that meeting because you want to bring your best self. And you may or may not have already sat down and thought about what you want for yourself. And the more you know, and that self-awareness will help others with supporting you on that journey. So there's a little bit of a dual-pronged approach there of making sure you sit down like Jarrett did, however he did, to figure out what he wants. And then in your case, going out and doing the work to get that meeting. It may take a couple of discussions. In my case, I will say that I've gotten tremendous opportunity just from raising my hand higher than everybody else. And I heard a quote once that enthusiasm counts for more than 25 IQ points. And whether it's IQ points or however else folks tend to measure de-risking allocating of work to different people, I have been the beneficiary as I learned to raise my hand. I've gotten to move to different countries on multiple locations to help start local departments for those companies. And when it came to starting my business, Integral, I just had so much more know-how as well as self-confidence in being able to start something from the ground up than I would have if I never did that on my own. Interestingly, the opposite also happened for me, where in one instance, I shared with the founder as well as my manager what my career aspirations were, and it seemed to kind of fall on deaf ears, despite bringing it up more than once. And that gave me the insight and the intel that it was time for me to move to another organization. And I wouldn't have necessarily gotten there quite as quickly and spent more time at a place where it wasn't helping me get to closer to what I wanted to. If I didn't have that discussion, I'd probably be sitting in a place of hope and assumption versus finding out for myself and then taking the associated actions next, which maybe helps me switch gears to the employer side of things. And at Integral, we implemented not just skip level one-on-ones where folks speak with not just their managers on occasion, but also their managers, and even with myself, the CEO, of course, at a much less periodic basis than they do with their immediate managers. And this allowed for the skips to reiterate the vision and the immediate priorities more on a one-on-one level and have more of a dialogue versus a megaphone style discussion there, where we got to hear from the employee a little bit more around what they thought about it, gather feedback and other forms of clarification, and allowed for us to understand where someone wanted to help as we chip away at getting closer to that vision. We also implemented ways in which employees didn't necessarily need to know what kind of roles they wanted to go into, but we were able to facilitate discussions where they could talk about what brought them energy to their roles and what maybe de-energized them, so that we were able to help them facilitate going from that introspection into potential roles. And certainly I found myself with a bias of allocating work to folks who were maybe not the most technically qualified, maybe they were the number 2 or number 3, but just were way more enthusiastic, knowing that when things maybe didn't go to plan or things weren't seeming to work out on an initiative, those folks who were the hand raisers would tend to overcome those little bumps and have a way more resilience, commitment, and engagement towards seeing that experiment through, versus other folks who maybe we allocated and didn't necessarily foster the same level of buy-in that might tend to have a lot more challenges when those road bumps and friction points come into play. So whether you're an employee who is looking to clarify what your career aspirations are, or an employer who is looking to make that a lot easier for your teammates, I hope that this additional tidbit provides some food for thought. And if you have any more questions, send me a DM or put it in the comments, and I'd be happy to continue this dialogue. Thanks a lot for listening, folks. Thank you for joining me on the Convergence Podcast today. Subscribe to the Convergence Podcast on Apple Podcast, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your content. If you're listening and found this helpful, please give us a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube, hit that like button and tell me what you think about what you heard today.